Good afternoon, friends and church family. It's Wednesday or Thursday afternoon, April 2nd, talking to you for the third week because of the COVID-19 shutdown, and now we have a stay-at-home order. So I'm staying at home and recording a personal message that try to encourage folks, and also record the message, the next passage in Mark that would have been preached on next Sunday, April 5th. So you get a preview of it, listen to it anytime now or after. Links to the messages are on the website. I believe also can access them from Facebook. And 80 some views from 2 weeks ago and 50 some from last week. So somebody's watching. One person complimented me and said I helped him go right to sleep. Oh, anyway, got to laugh at some of these things. There's a lot to be grateful for. God is still on his throne. He knows what he's doing. None of this has taken him by surprise, and I am just really pleased with how our church family is looking out for each other. Haven't heard any words of panic. I've been calling several families a day just to check in and encourage them. Everybody just seems to be taking all of this in stride. A couple of announcements. If you listen to this before the weekend, Food Pantry will be on as usual this Saturday, like we did 2 weeks ago. We'll just have people drive up to the back door and we will hand the groceries out to them. I was able to obtain a small supply of N95 face masks and latex gloves, so our volunteers will be well protected and keep a proper distance and yet still serve the needy in our community. I don't know who's bringing all the toilet paper to the box on the back, but the box was overflowing when I was over there last evening. So thank you for sharing, and I assume people are taking as well as bringing and sharing. Sooner or later, supply will catch up with demand. I was almost out of flour, but Shaw's had a big pallet there when I went grocery shopping last Friday. So just hang in there. This will pass. We got the month of April with the stay-at-home ban. We had thought previously we would consider having the outdoor Easter sunrise service, but we obviously can't do that, and because that would put us in violation of the stay at home except for the non-essentials. And what is non-essential is to love your neighbor as yourself and to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. That is non-essential. We are to gather together, but for the time being, that gathering will be with Zoom and via Facebook, website, uploaded messages, thought of the day that Aaron is doing a great job pumping that communication out for us. Speaking of which, if you are not on the e-newsletter list and getting the thought of the day, email Aaron. It's church@newhopedexter.org, and she will add you to that list. So everybody's staying safe. No virus, no confirmed cases in Piscataquis, and I think most or all of the ones in Penobscot are over Bangor way. So our people seem to be staying safe, and I am praying that it will stay that way for us. Life goes on. Life goes on. Death is inevitable, and it may come sooner than people expect, but take assurance that your life will not be one breath short of what God has preordained and already knows. And when you know Jesus, death holds no fear. So continuing on with life as much as normal as possible, the message just going to continue in Mark. And at the end of Mark, chapter 2, verse 23, it says, One Sabbath, as he was going through the grain fields and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, Look, why are they doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Lord Jesus, Lord over demons, control over the weather, control over disease, even death, even leprosy, which they called the walking death. We see growing controversy that Jesus brought. And this is not going to be the last conflict we see in our study with the established religion, the Pharisees, scribes, Sadducees. You know, it's not unusual for God's ways to come into conflict with man's ideas about religion, even opposition from those who should have known better. The Old Testament prophets were persecuted for bringing God's word, God's message, his warnings to his people. The reformers persecuted. I think of Savonarola, Florentine Dominican monk who got saved by reading his Latin Bible, much like Martin Luther and other reformers came to the realization that the established church was in grave error. He preached reform, he preached the gospel, but he also preached against the social injustices of his time, preached against the corrupt politicians, preached against the corrupt religious establishment that was trying to sell salvation. Same thing that really set Martin Luther off. He openly had people that were saved bring their pornography, their gambling equipment, and made bonfires in the town square. Well, his undoing was when he criticized Pope Alexander VI and was burned at the stake in Florence, Italy in 1498. History of the church has always been a conflict of worlds. Man's ideas versus God's ways. We see basic conflict of philosophies here in this passage. Was the Sabbath given to bind man up with laws, rules, and regulations, or was it given to benefit man? Stated differently, we have look, for example, in 2 Corinthians 3, 5-6. Not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything as coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. The legalistic, formal approach to religion in Jesus' day kept people in bondage. He's told them in another place that you teach people to carry burdens that you can't even lift. Is the Christian under the law? Just one that I can think of. Galatians 5:14. The entire law is summed up in one single command: love your neighbor as yourself. Or you could add on the second. Jesus said the two greatest commandments in Matthew 22, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. See, when you talk about the 10 biggies, the 10 commandments, the Sabbath was the only one that was ceremonial and was for Israel. Jews were to keep it, set aside work, get your work done in 6 days, have a time of rest and worship and time with families. The other 9 remained in effect in a different way, not to bind man as though man could ever be good enough and keep all of the laws, but they provided social order, even as they formed the basis for our laws in Western society. Don't kill, don't commit murder, don't go rob a bank, don't sleep with your neighbor's wife, don't covet what your neighbor has. That's all summed up, those 9 are all summed up in that law of love. Love your neighbor as yourself. And when you have a new heart that Jesus gives you, you won't even want to kill your neighbor or sleep with his wife. Your soul will be pulled towards God and a true righteousness that comes from within, not from rules and regulations that are imposed from without. Let's consider that we are following the Lord in obedience to that spirit of the law of love, if you will. This passage demonstrates how Jesus cut through the chaff of legalism to the real issues that concern one's relationship with God. Let's talk about that law of love. How can we know what it is and how can we follow it? There are some principles embedded in this teaching here, this instant conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees. The first principle was realize that the bulk of the law was really given to benefit man. There were ceremonial laws like circumcision that was to set aside the Jews as God's chosen people, and that was for the old covenant. We're not Jews, we're not under those laws and regulations. There were ceremonial laws, how and when and what kind of sacrifices to offer for sin offerings, thank offerings, the festivals that all really had pointed forward to Jesus. You can find him foreshadowed in all of the Jewish times of celebration, holidays, festivals. What we see going on here was perfectly legal. in contrast to what the Pharisees were trying to impose. They were walking along. Were they stealing somebody's grain? Deuteronomy 23:25 said that this was a provision that God provided for the traveler. Going on foot or donkey, there were no McDonald's in the towns. People could take lunches with them, but when you were traveling, you got hungry. Deuteronomy 23:24 and 25 says, if you go into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes, as many as you wish, but you shall not put any in your bag. If you go into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain. Well, that would be thieving. It would be stealing his livelihood. But there also were laws that the edges of the field, the corners and edges of the fields, were to be not harvested by the owner and the workers. They were to be left for the poor to come and glean that harvest, so they would have something to eat. Both Matthew and Mark say the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The rabbis openly taught that man was made for the Sabbath. They were imposing a burden on what God intended to be a blessing. It's interesting, the Sabbath principle. I don't have exact statistics, but I have read that in communist and atheistic and communist countries that tried to increase production by doing away with a day of rest and working people 7 days a week year-round, productivity went down. I believe it was either China or Russia, they experimented with, well, let's increase productivity by giving it every 10th day off or working 10 days and then one. Again, productivity was down from what happened when people had every 7th day off to let the body and mind and spirit rest. The Sabbath was made for man's benefit. And it benefits us when we take that extra time to just worship the Lord, to be in tune with our Creator. What a joy it is to gather together as God's people on the first day of the week for us. Not Sabbath is a Saturday, but the early church began to gather the first day of the week, which was Resurrection Day. What a blessing it is to worship God with brothers and sisters. And I miss that, and I look forward to when we can do that and get together again. The Pharisees were bound up with impossibly heavy burdens that they made for themselves. Sabbath was there, was in the law. It had some people were not to work. They were not to carry burdens and not to harvest their crops. But let me read you something from a good commentator, John MacArthur, that is very good about researching the historical and cultural things that are going on that you don't pick up just by reading the scripture text. When Jesus began his ministry, the Old Covenant was still in effect, and all of its requirements were binding on Jews, the special people of the covenant. Jesus observed every demand and met every condition of Scripture because it was his own word, which he came to fulfill and not destroy. But for several hundred years, the various schools of rabbis had added regulation after regulation, going far beyond the teaching of Scripture, and in many instances actually contradicting it. In no area were these additions more extensive and extreme than in regard to Sabbath observance. Keeping the Sabbath was still a binding ceremonial obligation for Israel, but most Jews had little idea of the original purpose of the Sabbath or how God intended it to be honored. Instead of being a day of rest, it had become a day of incredible burden because of the thousands of man-made restrictions regarding it. The Sabbath was more tiresome than the 6 days devoted to one's occupation. It was harder to rest than to earn a living. Jewish tradition had even caused the Sabbath to be dangerous. The apocryphal book of 1 Maccabees tells of an incident during the time of Judas Maccabeus, when a group of Jews refused to defend themselves on the Sabbath against the Greek army led by Antiochus Epiphanes. As the soldiers of Antiochus attacked, the Jews answered them not, neither cast they a stone at them, nor stopped the places where they lay hid, but said, Let us die in our innocency. Heaven and earth shall testify o'er us that ye put us to death wrongfully. So they rose up against them in battle on the Sabbath, and they slew them with their wives and children and cattle, to the number of 1,000 people. And in his book, The Antiquities, the Jewish historian Josephus reports that it was also because Jews would not defend themselves on the Sabbath that the Roman general Pompey was able to capture Jerusalem. As was the custom in ancient Roman warfare, Pompey began to build a high mound from which his troops could bombard the cities. Aware that the Jews defending in Jerusalem would not oppose him, then the general did all construction work on the Sabbath. And I quote, "Had it not been for that practice from the days of our forefathers to rest on the Sabbath day," Josephus wrote, "this bank could never have been perfected by reason of the opposition the Jews would have made. For though our law gave us leave then to defend ourselves against those that begin to fight with us and assault us, yet it does not permit us to meddle with our enemies while they're doing anything else." So they built their rampart up against the wall of Jerusalem one day a week, the Sabbath, and the Jews left them alone. One section alone of the Talmud, the major compilation of Jewish tradition, has 24 chapters listing Sabbath laws. One law specified that the basic limit for travel was 3,000 feet from one's house, but various exceptions were provided. If you had placed some food within 3,000 feet of your house, you could go there to eat it, and because the food was considered an extension of the house, you could then go another 3,000 feet beyond the food. If a rope were placed across an adjoining street or alley, the building on the other side, as well as the alley between, could be considered part of your home. Certain objects could be lifted up and put down only from and to certain places. Other things could be lifted up from a public place and set down in a private one, and vice versa. Still others could be picked up in a wide place and put down in a legally free place, but rabbis could not agree on the meaning of wide and free. Under Sabbath regulations, a Jew could not carry a load heavier than a dried fig, but if an object weighed half that amount, he could carry it twice. Eating restrictions were among the most detailed and extensive. You could eat nothing larger than an olive, and even if you tasted half an olive, found it to be rotten and spit it out, that half was considered to have been eaten as far as the allowance was concerned. Throwing an object into the air with one hand and catching it with the other was prohibited. If the Sabbath overtook you as you reached for some food, the food was to be dropped before drawing your arm back, lest you be guilty of carrying a burden. Tailors could not carry a needle with them on the Sabbath for fear they might be tempted to mend a garment and thereby perform work. Nothing could be bought or sold. Clothing could not be dyed or washed. A letter could not be dispatched, even if you sent a Gentile to deliver it. No fire could be lit or extinguished, including fire for a lamp, although a fire already lit could be used within certain limits. For that reason, some Orthodox Jews today use automatic timers to turn on lights in their homes well before the Sabbath begins. Otherwise, they might forget to turn them on in time and have to spend the night in the dark. Baths could not be taken for fear some of the water would spill onto the floor and wash it. Chairs could not be moved because dragging them might make a furrow in the ground. And a woman was not to look in a mirror lest she see a gray hair and be tempted to pull it out. You could carry ink enough to draw only 2 letters of the alphabet, and false teeth could not be worn because they exceeded the weight limit for burdens. According to those hair-splitting regulations, a Jew could not pull off even a handful of grain to eat on the Sabbath unless he were starving, which of course is often a difficult thing to determine and would cause for considerable difference of opinion. If a person became ill on the Sabbath, only enough treatment could be given to keep him alive. Treatment to make him improve was to be declared work and thereby forbidden. To determine just how much food, medicine, or bandaging would be necessary to keep a person alive and no more was itself an impossible burden. Among many other forbidden Sabbath activities were sowing, plowing, reaping, grinding, baking, threshing, binding sheaves, winnowing, sifting, dyeing, shearing, spinning, kneading, separating or weaving 2 threads, tying or untying a knot, and sewing 2 stitches. The Sabbath was anything but a time of rest to become a time of oppressive frustration and anxiety. The people were sick to death of this system that had been imposed on them by ungodly, worldly legalists, and they were indeed weary and heavy laden. To whom Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." That's what the Jews lived under. How would you like that? And things have not been a lot better with that kind of restrictions in some circles, even Baptist circles. Think of my mother-in-law. That you were to keep the Sabbath, which to Baptists was the equivalent of Sunday. Growing up in a pastor's home, she could sit on her swing, but was not allowed to swing because you can't have fun and entertain yourself on a Sunday. Sabbaths were to be set aside not just for rest, relaxation, and fellowship, but legalistically kept even throughout a lot of the history of fundamental churches. Thank God we've come a long way from that at New Hope Baptist. First principle, realize the bulk of the law was given to benefit man. The Sabbath was made for us, not us to carry a burden, and burden upon burden upon burden that so-called religious leaders that should have known better would impose to show off their piety and supposed pretentious, hypocritical godliness. Second principle, realize that true religion, Christianity, does not consist of rules and regulations. They flow out of a love for the Lord and a love for others that comes from the heart. Underlying principle, reasons behind the rules. Is it okay to speed? Speed limits are there. We are to obey the government and the laws of the land if they don't conflict with our Christian values or our consciences. Speed limits are there for the good of people like us, so that controls traffic and people don't drive recklessly. Is it ever okay to speed? Well, think back a few summers ago, we had a church picnic down by my pond, and an elderly gentleman began getting heart pains and he passed out. Well, we had a nurse in the group, could have called 911, but I figured I can get him to the hospital faster than an ambulance would take to get here and then carry him. So we loaded him in the car and I put on the emergency flashers, and you bet I went as fast as I possibly could and got him to the emergency room. Or my son Michael, when their youngest boy was about to be born, living up in Greenville, Debbie's contractions got down to 3 minutes apart. He started very quickly, got in the car and sped, and got pulled over by a sheriff's deputy. Son Michael kept his hands on the steering wheel, and he said, "Officer, I'm a federal officer. I have a gun, but my wife is just about to deliver. Her contractions are 2 to 3 minutes apart." Well, the officer looked horrified, and instead of giving him a ticket, he gave him an escort to the hospital, and they got there in plenty of time. Shouldn't lie. Honesty is a high virtue to have. Is it ever okay to deceive or lie? Now, not everybody would agree with me on this, and if you don't, that's fine. But let me pose questions to you, like, would it be okay for a Christian law enforcement person to go undercover, pretend to be a drug dealer, pretend to purchase drugs in order to catch and prosecute those that bring that scourge of drugs across our country? I think you could, in very good conscience. May not lie, but you are still deceiving, which is pretty much one and the same. Could a Christian serve as a spy for their country in time of war? I mean, rules of warfare very much acknowledge that that's part of being at war. There are going to be spies that come, and you send your own spy to gather intelligence. So are there ever exceptions to God's laws? Jesus said in Matthew that in the same instance that compassion outweighs keeping the law according to them. Compassion. True religion, according to James, is to feed widows and orphans. It's to show compassion for your neighbor that flows out of a heart that's been born again, created in God's image, who has the biggest heart of compassion of anybody in the universe. True religion Christianity does not consist of rules and regulations. There are always exceptions to laws. What was the law? What did the law require for murder? The murderer was to be executed. Yet God showed compassion to King David when he was guilty of having Uriah the Hittite killed. That was murder. Even though it weren't his hands that got bloodied by doing it, by the law, he was guilty. But God showed mercy. Nothing illegal about plucking grain, because that was a provision for travelers, as long as they weren't harvesting the grain and stealing from the livelihood of the farm owner. And realize, thirdly, that if a rule, one of those laws, man-made rules and laws, strips you of compassion for human need, it probably isn't from God. We see here where David talks about the high priest Abiathar. That's from 1 Samuel 21, verses 1 to 6, where Jonathan had warned David, "Dad's still out to kill you. You better run or he's going to get you." So he took his men with him and ran into the wilderness. I'll read that. David came to Nob to Abimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came to meet David trembling and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" And David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has charged me with a matter and said to me, 'Let no one know anything of the matter about which I send you, and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with young men for such and such a place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, and whatever you have here." And the priest answered David, "I have no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have kept themselves from women." And David answered, "Truly, women have been kept from us as always when I go on an expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it's an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy?" So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord to be placed by hot bread the day it is taken away. What the law required for the priests in the tabernacle was every Sabbath to bake 12 loaves of bread and leave on the altar or table in the tabernacle. They were to remain there for a week, and the next Sabbath to be replaced with fresh bread, and the week from the previous bread was only to be eaten by the priests. Abimelech willingly gave that bread to David. Again, compassion and mercy trumps law, even God's law, when there are exceptions to be made, as was done in time, and Jesus reminded them. You can almost see their faces when he says to Pharisees, the experts on the law, "Haven't you guys read about this incident with David and Abimelech?" I think we're in trouble here. Jesus, many times, instead of answering a question directly, answered a question with another question. "Haven't you guys read?" James 1:27 says, "Religion that's pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained for the world." Really, it's pretty simple, pretty uncomplicated. Love God, love your neighbor. All of those rules and regulations that God gave in the Old Testament, except for the ceremonial laws that were unique under Old Covenant to be kept by the Jews, all of those are summed up in love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you'd have them do to you, and you're good. 1 John, some other verses to back that up. 1 John 4:19-21. We love because he first loved us. If anyone says, "I love God," and hates his brother, he's a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, whoever loves God must also love his brother. Romans 13:8-10. Owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. Get that? You fulfilled the law if you love your brother or sister. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. That's New Covenant. Those laws that were relational in the Old Testament are summed up. And when a person has a new heart that Jesus gives you, your desires will be to love your neighbor as yourself and to show it, not just in word or speech, but in deed and in deed and in truth, as 1 John 3:18 says. Too many times, Christians and some that I've rubbed shoulders with and still continue to run into violate that law of love by keeping the letter of the law. Take, for example, abortion. I think all evangelical and fundamental Christians would agree that abortion is morally wrong. It's a taking of a human life, an innocent human life. That is not the issue. What do you do with someone that has made that terrible decision to terminate their pregnancy? Too often they've been shamed. They carry the shame already and the guilt of that. They need compassion and healing. Instead of, I'm glad that increasingly so, there are places like the Crisis Pregnancy Center that we support in Bangor that show compassion to young ladies that many times, sadly kicked out of Christian homes because the parents are ashamed of them and they want to shame them and somehow think that maybe it makes them feel more righteous, a hypocritical way about themselves. I thank God that New Hope is not one of those kind of places. People that have made terrible mistakes, sinful mistakes, like having an abortion, Come find healing. Come find healing. There's forgiveness. Doesn't matter what sin you've committed, what laws you've broken, man's laws or God's laws. He's always there, like the prodigal son's father, with open arms to welcome you into his family. Last principle that I see here, realize that the right response will probably be 180 degrees opposite the first inclination. In other words, we still have that struggle between the flesh that we live in and the spirit, that new heart, that new spirit that lives within us. Pharisee, human nature is to, when you're wrong, what do you want to do? Defend yourself. Blame somebody else. That's what the Pharisees were doing. They know they got caught with their hand in the proverbial cookie jar. So the conflicts will continue. It's easy to make rules to follow, makes people feel comfortable. Well, I've gone to church 3 times this week. I've read my Bible every day. I remember scripture. I've witnessed to 10 people. I guess I'm good with God. Now, man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. Yes, God spoke through the prophet Samuel. I like a quote from Albert Einstein. The only thing more dangerous than ignorance is arrogance. Get that? The only thing more dangerous than ignorance is arrogance. Let's be certain that in our hearts we're worshiping God and serving Him from the heart, going by the spirit of the law, which is put in our hearts by the Spirit of God. Not fall into the trap of the legalism of the Pharisees, not judge other people that see things a little differently on non-essential issues. Let's follow those principles that the Lord has laid out here. Realize that the bulk of the law was given to benefit man. Realize that true religion, Christianity, being that one true religion, does not consist of rules and regulations. Realize that if a rule strips one of compassion for human need, it probably isn't from God. And finally, realize that the right response will not be found in the flesh and maybe not your first response. Let's be certain that our worship is pleasing to God, that our hearts are pure. And again, I commend our folks for ministering to one another, ministering to our community. And I'm going to close with a parable of William Barton, a preacher back in the early 1900s, wrote in parable form about Saphid the Sage, parables of the Saphid the Sage. And I'm going to share one called The Dummy Organ Pipe. Now it came to pass as I journeyed that I came upon a great church, which the builders were making greater. And they pulled down a certain portion of the wall and builded it westward, and they removed the organ and builded one greater. Now the organ that had been within the church had been sweet of tone, but it was deemed too small, and moreover it had grown rickety, so that it croaked and squeaked and squawked and did those things which it ought not to have done, and left undone the things which it ought to have done. Wherefore they removed it. But the pipes therein were still good, and they saved them with care to be builded into another and greater organ. Now the old organ had never been so great as it seemed, but had been builded into a larger space than it could occupy. And one half of the pipes in the front row were real pipes, and the other half were dummies. And the organ had stood for 40 years, and no man sitting in front of it could have told that half the pipes were dummies, nor could he have told which were the real pipes and which were the dummies. But when the organ was removed, the real pipes were packed with care and sent away to a great factory, there to be rebuilded into some other organ. But the dummy pipes, some larger and some smaller, were cast into the junk to be hauled away into the valley of Hinnom, which same is the valley outside the city gates, like unto that which near Jerusalem is called hell, where the worm dieth not, because it feedeth ever upon refuse, and the fire is not quenched, was because they ever hauled to it more junk. Now as the dummy pipes waited for the coming of the hokey-pokey man to haul them to the valley of Hinnom, one of the workmen took the largest of the pipes, which was 12 cubits long, and was like unto a real pipe, which might have given forth the tone of middle C in the open diapason, but which had never given forth a tone, for it was a dummy. And the workman took it, and placed it at the end of a sewer pipe, for the same had been broken apart in the building. Yet the sewer was still in use in the older part of the sanctuary, but there was need for certain days that a temporary pipe should be placed there, lest the filth should run out in the place where workmen wrought, and there was more work that had to be done before the plumbers could make the sewer connection. So I came, and behold, and lo, the beautiful pipe that was 12 cubits in length and half a cubit breadth was in use as a drain for the drainage of filth. And I was displeased. And I sought out the master of the workmen, and I said, What do ye, defiling a pipe that hath had its place in the organ? Surely ye have done an unholy thing. And he said, That pipe's doing good service, and it had been thrown away, was good for nothing else. Wherefore should we spend money and have the work delayed to buy a pipe when here's one at our hand that's big enough and long enough to meet our needs? Nay, I said, but not this pipe, for this hath had its part in the worship of the house of God. And even though it was cast aside, I would have it treated reverently. But the master of the workmen spake to me sternly, and he said, Business is business. Take heed to thy preaching, and I will attend to my building. We must use what material we can from the old building to save us money on the new. For what with the high cost of living and the peril of strikes, it's hard enough to pay expenses as it is. Then I said, Lo, I'm a poor man, yet will I pay for a sheet iron pipe for that place, that a thing be not defiled with filth that had place in the worship of God. But the master builder said to me, Keep thy money, and be not too free with it. As for the pipe, trouble not thyself. 40 years it stood in the house of God, falsely proclaiming itself to give forth sweet music, and it gave none. This is the first time since it was made that it hath ever been any use under heaven. Let it be used for the one thing it's good for, and then let it go with the junk. Then I went my way, and I meditated, and I said, Lo, this is the portion of the hypocrite. For though he stand in his place in the house of God for 40 years, yet at the end shall he appear as a hollow mockery, and God shall find for him whatever place he can still be of use, but it may not be a pleasant occupation. And many times thereafter I thought about the dummy organ pipe and the dummy Christian. And I said, Lo, if it must be that any man whose life was a sham shall go to the valley of the sons of Hinnom, the ways of the Lord are just and righteous altogether. But I remembered that the dummy pipe was decorated with gold leaf and good to look upon, and I sorrowed at the base use to which it was put, but I could not deny that it was useful in the end.